So the agenda for today, we're just gonna go over some announcements and some info for next week, and then get into the talk, and then take a break, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end of the at the end of the presentation. So the first announcement, I bet y'all are wondering what your grades are like. And next week, there's going to be a check-in with your facilitators where you can get all the answers to your questions, and yeah, and they'll be there to answer them. And so there's also going to be a spreadsheet that's gonna be sent to you. I'm pretty sure it's gonna be by email, and it's gonna have your student ID and then the grade correlated with your student ID, and that's just gonna be the grade for I believe it's for your midterm. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody. But yeah, you'll get more information on that next week, so no worries. And then the second announcement is there's an event this Friday. It's called A Sacred Basket, and all these different organizations are hosting a virtual summit centering discussions of identity and indigenous epistemologies, oral history, storytelling, art and connection to the land, ancestors, and the organic universe outside of the Western narrative. Yeah, they're asking for art submissions and workshop submissions, and we'll be hosting a virtual poster session. So you can register for that using this link right here. And yeah, this Friday. And also another reminder, the UCSC elections are, I'm pretty sure they're on now, yeah, from May 11th till May 20th. And the Measure 74, the sustainability office fee, is on the ballot for the renewal this year. This undergraduate fee starts at $3 per quarter and maxes out at $326 by 2030. And the measure funds about 25 plus paid undergraduate student positions and other campus-wide sustainability opportunities. So yeah, vote yes. So we can continue doing these awesome opportunities for students, and yeah, for the next decade. So reminders for next week, the speaker is going to be Edgar Exochi. I think that's how you pronounce the last name. But yeah, we're going to be talking about decolonizing botany through recognizing all forms of knowledge and understanding the parallels with queer liberation. And yeah, some last minute reminders. The midterm grades will be released soon, and yeah, facilitators will check in with you for week 8. And yeah, I guess we'll get started with introducing Alvaro. So Mr. Sanchez is an urban planner with extensive experience crafting, implementing, and evaluating strategies that leverage private and public investments to deliver community benefits to priority communities. Alvaro is the Greenlining Institute's Director of Environmental Equity. He leads a team that develops policies to improve public health, catalyze economic opportunities, and enrich environmental quality for low-income communities and communities of color by leveraging public resources that address pollution, fight climate change, and help vulnerable communities adapt to changing environment. Alvaro oversees Greenlining's climate equity portfolio, including monitoring the implementation of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, SB 535 and AB 1550, and implementation of Greenlining's framework on equitable and clean mobility, climate adaptation, and resilience, and creating an equitable economy. So yeah, I think we're ready to jump into the presentation. I can hand it over to Alvaro.
Thank you. I'm gonna start sharing my screen here. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and inviting me to share a little bit of my work with all of you. I'm looking forward to, I'm looking forward to today. Today, again, I'm Alvaro Sanchez. I'm the Director of Environmental Equity at the Greenlining Institute. And as the Director of Environmental Equity, I lead a team that works on strategies to address poverty and pollution. In this work, what I do is I work on policy and advancing clean energy strategies. One question: are you able to see the slides, or are you seeing the speaker notes that are appearing on my laptop?
I believe we can just see the slides. I don't think we can see, any.
Okay, excellent, great. Wanted to make sure. Today I have two objectives with you. One is to share policy-based solutions to environmental racism. And second is to walk you through how at Greenlining we envision making equity real, which is something that we call Making Equity Real framework, which is a tool to advance equity in policymaking. So that's going to be our goals for today. Today, we're going to be talking very explicitly about race. And if I do this right, it will make some of us feel a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. Being uncomfortable is a necessary part in the process of our collective work towards justice and sustainability. Some of us were taught at an early age that talking about race wasn't something that was polite. But working on equity and doing it right means that we can't ignore this country's racist legacy, and it means that we must recognize the present day struggles of our Black and Brown communities and how we're impacted by it. So today we're going to be talking very explicitly about race. But before we kind of get going with the conversation, I'd like to do a little bit of level setting with you by asking you what equity means to you. And to do this, we're going to break up into small groups. And in those small groups, I'd like for you to answer 5 questions. The first question that you answer in your small groups is going to be, why is it that if you're a poor person of color in the United States, you are more likely than any other demographic group to live in a community with high levels of poverty and pollution? Once somebody in your group gives us a response, we're just going to ask why. So for example, if somebody says in your small group that the reason for that fact is that it depends on where people choose to live, we're going to ask why. Why does it depend on that decision? And then we're going to ask why 3 additional times after that. And then at the culmination of those 5 questions, we'll come back as a big group. Thank you, everyone. I'm assuming we're all coming back to the main group now. Before kind of just plowing ahead towards the next part of the presentation, anybody want to kind of reflect on what may have been that last why that you may have answered in your small group?
I guess just going off your original question of kind of why poverty is just associated with non-whites, I just kind of think about like how far do you want to think back on it? Within the last like 100 years, there was a lot of policies that were made that were what I'm just thinking of, like housing and stuff like that. That's a big one within the last 100 years, where it was directed at all Americans, but then there was a lot of bias for selling homes towards white communities, and as soon as someone that wasn't perfectly Caucasian showed up, then everyone left, and the housing markets, or in the housing for that area, basically just dropped. And so there's a huge bias, which definitely really didn't help at all. And none of these people were given a chance at all. You know, they all wanted to just buy a house and live a nice life, but they weren't even given a chance.
Right.
So.
Right. Thank you, Eric, for sharing. And that was a really good setup to the rest of the presentation. So, it was important for us to kind of get started with this level setting because as we move forward in our conversation, One of the things that we have to kind of get on the same page about is on what is it that we mean by the word equity. And the reason why it's important for us to be on the same page around what does it mean by the word equity is that if we have different definitions of equity and we have different definitions of root causes, we may be kind of working towards different outcomes. And that often tends to happen a lot on policymaking. So the first thing that we want to do here is to establish a common definition of equity. And what you see on the screen right now is how Greenlining defines equity. For us, equity is transforming the behaviors, institutions, and symptoms that disproportionately harm people of color. Equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach full potential. Now, many people will have different definitions, but it's important that whenever you talk about racial equity or about equity policy, that there's a standard definition that you share with your colleagues in order to kind of be working towards similar solutions. So it was important for me to be able to establish this definition with all of you so that as we go through this presentation, you kind of know what kind of equity is that Greenlining is practicing. So in order to share why race matters in policy and why we must lead with racial equity, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. First, I'm going to tell you the story of the past and recount how the history of race in America and how it relates to our built environment and our economy. Then I'm going to tell you the story of the present and how the past manifests today in pain and injustice for people of color. And finally, I'm going to tell you the story of tomorrow and how we can work together to create a society that is just, healthy, and in a society where all people can thrive. So let's start with the story of the past. Imagine that is the middle of the 1930s and we're in the middle of the Great Depression. And actually, it's not hard to imagine that because currently we're going to be going through something very similar. But in the 1930s, many families were struggling to make ends meet, and many of them were defaulting on their mortgages. As a response, the federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help families build wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received the same type of help. Many historians credit this policy to helping families rebuild their lives during this crisis. But there's also a shameful side of the story, and one that is not often talked about. It is one that is rooted in racism, and one that our government and the real estate industry is directly responsible for. To figure out how to distribute mortgages, governments worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on credit risk. San Jose is one of those communities as shown in this map here. They created a grading system based on several factors like quality of housing. But the primary indicator of risk was race. So the blue means still desirable. Yellow meant definitely declining, and red meant hazardous. Areas that were redlined were seen as credit risks because of the presence of people of color. This is the term where redlining comes from. Between 1932 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion worth of loans, and more than 98% of them went to white families. This lack of investment in communities of color has led to extreme wealth inequality that we see today along racial lines. Now what you see here is an audit from surveyors hired by the city of Oakland in 1937. As you could see, it includes some offensive language and explicitly names, quote, the infiltration of Negroes and Orientals as a determinant influence on this community and the reason for its redlining. To further illustrate how egregious this policy was, the Federal Housing Administration had a manual which said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. And for good measure, this manual recommended using highways as a good way to separate Black neighborhoods from white ones. So for all intents and purposes, this was a state-sponsored system of segregation. Redlining was instituted all over the country. And as we know, home ownership is the primary way that families built intergenerational wealth. And people of color were effectively locked out of this opportunity. Now, I want to be clear. Redlining still exists today. It's just done in a much more subtle way. Black homebuyers are still twice as likely to be turned down for a loan than white homebuyers are today. And redlining didn't just impact homeownership. Redlining combined with zoning, disenfranchisement, and disinvestment concentrated polluting industries and highways in these neighborhoods. And while redlining was technically outlawed decades ago, this lack of investment still has lingering impacts today. Another part of the story of the past is the story of highways and the systematic redesign of our cities for the automobile. Highways were constructed often directly through communities of color, destroying local neighborhood economies and locking in air pollution and detrimental health impacts for decades to come. These highways enabled white flight from cities to the suburbs, which were often designed as white-only neighborhoods. And as a result, this trend shifted investment in commercial development, corporate headquarters, and other businesses from cities and into the wealthier, wider suburbs. This neglect and disinvestment of the inner cities across the United States only further disenfranchised communities of color. Today, we're seeing the inverse of this happening as white flight is beginning to take place, and then white folks are coming back into the inner core suburb, urban core, and displacing long-term residents of color, pushing them into suburbs that are often isolated, suffering from poor infrastructure and housing, and far away from employment and other social networks. Redlining and highways were born from America's long legacy of racist public policies. And today, subversive versions of redlining continue to take a toll on people of color. So ever since the founding of this country on genocide of Native people, to slavery, to Jim Crow laws, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Japanese internment, and even to today's immigration camps, race has always determined winners and losers in America. The private sector and the public sector worked hand in hand to build these structures of inequality. And over time, this history has accumulated and compounded. And the impacts is that many generations of individuals and institutions have been conditioned to fear Black and brown folks, to see us as subhuman, to see us as inferior, and not worthy of their time or investment. The result is that these attitudes and policies work together to prop up segregation, racism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy. Now let's remember, this history was not created by just a few actors. These were all deliberate public policy decisions that were carried out by the federal, state, and local government. Government created these injustices, and so government must also play an important role in addressing them. So the story of the past is heavy, and it hits hard. But I'm showing you these photos because we always have to keep this legacy in mind. Because while I wish that I could say that racial injustice is a thing of the past, it isn't. Our country has never fully confronted our legacy of racial injustice in a meaningful way. And I believe that we must in order to rectify the injustices of the past. And so now I'm going to transition to telling you the story of today. How people of color are still struggling with the legacy of these racist policies, but also how we're beginning to address these disparities caused by these racist policies. As we all know now, COVID-19 is creating tremendous impacts in our communities. And is really pulling the curtains on America's deep-rooted inequities. People of color are the most impacted by this crisis. Latinx communities are seeing some of the highest numbers of COVID cases, and African Americans are seeing some of the highest death rates related to COVID. The economic impacts associated with COVID are similarly impacting Black and Brown communities most severely. And when I saw this map of San Francisco's COVID cases, I couldn't help but notice the striking similarities with two other maps that I had seen in the past. So what you see here is the redlining map of San Francisco from the 1930s. The middle map is a CalEnviroscreen map, which is California's tool to figuring out where communities are, where poverty and pollution are most pronounced. And the last one is where the COVID cases in San Francisco have been most pronounced. And I'm sure you can tell the similarities between all of them. What we see here is literally the trajectory of these policy decisions that are having impacts on our communities today. Policies like redlining did not just limit access to economic opportunity. The combination of being locked out of homeownership plus disenfranchisement plus lack of representation and systematic oppression resulted in communities that could not control what was happening to them. This graph is from a study of California's cap and trade program. It shows that the biggest two indicators of people that live near polluting facilities are class and race. And in fact, race is the biggest predictor of living near a polluting facility in California. And this fact is now have been proven that it's the same all over the country. So if you're a poor person of color, you're almost guaranteed to live near a polluting facility that has been proven to be detrimental to human life. This didn't just happen by design, so that others could benefit. And power plays a big role in the story of today. A large contributor to why marginalized people are still struggling is a result of who is at the decision-making table. On the left, this graphic shows that the racial makeup of the top transportation decision makers in the US does not accurately represent the demographic of the communities they make decisions for, seen on the right. And even though these numbers are a few years old, we know that the proportion of people of color is growing, yet it is very unlikely that the diversity of decision makers is also increasing at the same rate. So when we talk about equity, we also have to talk about representation. Just imagine how different our society would look if women and people of color were accurately represented in decision-making spaces. The result of these compounding racist housing and transportation policies is a racial wealth gap that looks like this today. The following infographic shows the scale of America's racial wealth divide. Now let's remember, wealth is different from income, in that wealth takes into account assets that are held by a person or a household, including savings, real estate, and other financial holdings. In fact, if you have enough wealth, it generates income without having to work for it. Since 1983, Black and Latino families have seen their wealth fall considerably from $6,800 and $4,000 to just $1,700 and $2,000 respectively. Let that sink in. Black and Latino median wealth in 2013 was $1,700 and $2,000. That compared to $116,000 in 2013 for their white counterparts. Now, this research shows that the trajectory is going to widen the economic wealth gap between these racial groups. And this was done pre-COVID-19. With the situation that we're currently facing, this economic wealth gap is likely to increase even more so than it was shown here. Yet, if we were to eliminate this racial wealth gap, America's annual GDP could be $2 trillion higher. $2 trillion was the GDP of India in 2015. So closing the racial wealth gap isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. So environmental racism is not new. It is built on a foundation of policy decisions designed with race as a principal factor, implemented by the federal, state, and local government, reinforced and ratified by law enforcement and the courts, and exploited by private companies to reap economic benefits at the expense of vulnerable communities. All of this translates to a loss of life, literally. People of color all over the country have life expectancies far below that of white communities, primarily due to where they live. So it is no surprise that COVID-19 cases are disproportionately concentrated in Latinx and Black communities. In this graph, you see that Latinx and Black communities contain a higher percentage of cases compared to their share of population. This is Alameda County, but is representative of the US overall. Notice that white people in Alameda County account for more than 40% of the population and make up 15% of COVID cases, whereas Latinx people account for 25% of COVID cases, but make up less than 25% of the population. So as we try to recover from this serious health crisis, which has translated into an economic crisis, we need to focus on who is impacted the most. Race matters in our policymaking, and it can't be race neutral. The policy that created the perfect conditions for COVID to ravage Latinx and Black communities was race conscious. So our response has to be race conscious as well. People who believe in science and data can't say that race does not matter. If they do, those people only like to believe the data that wants to keep white supremacy in place because it benefits them. We are entering the greatest economic recession of our lifetime, far surpassing what happened with the Great Recession of 2008. And as it was then, Latinx and Black people are suffering much larger numbers of unemployed, like you see in this graph here. So as we recover from this crisis, we must do so with equity at the core. Equality is not good enough because the most impacted have been most impacted for a long time and require additional resources to catch up. They are further behind, not because they didn't work hard enough. They are further behind because of genocide, slavery, imperialism, and white supremacy. Equity is not a special interest, it's a common one. If we care about people, planet, and prosperity, I think we must embrace equity. So with that sunny outlook, I wanna break you up into small groups again. And this time, when we go into small groups, I want you to answer two questions. The first question is, how does equity or inequality show up in your personal life or in your community? What are some examples of that? And then the second question is, have you heard of any policy solution that may help advance equity in your community? Is there anything that you've seen that may address these systematic systems of oppression? So we're gonna break up into small groups again. We'll give everyone, again, about 7 minutes. And then after those 7 minutes, we'll come back as a big group. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining your small group, and welcome back to this bigger group. If you feel like it and you want to share kind of some of the things that you discussed in your small group, feel free to add them to the chat. And as we go through the rest of the presentation, we might come back to them, particularly on examples of policies or initiatives that you are seeing where equity is emphasized as an approach. So yeah, it'd be great to hear some of that. A couple of things that I want to highlight from the small group that I participated in is that inequities show up in many different ways, right? Inequities show up on a personal level, on an institutional level, and a societal level. And we're all kind of impacted by different kinds of inequities. So it's really important for us to realize that as we develop policy proposals that seek to address inequities, they also happen in those different stages. Sometimes they're personal, like financial aid programs that help individuals get advancement in their careers. Sometimes they're institutional, like, for example, making decisions on a budget to prioritize funding for certain activities that promote the development of certain communities that have been impacted, or societal, right? A societal benefit, for example, is going to be emphasized in the following part of my presentation. So we'll just go ahead and kind of get back into the flow. So now that we kind of have a common understanding of the inequities that we're all experiencing, and the legacy of policies that have created conditions where communities of color are predominantly impacted by poverty and pollution, I want to transition us over to some solutions. So what do we do about it? How do we address the fact that these communities are having real life impacts today, but also we seek to make our society one that it doesn't have those root causes. And for the purposes of the rest of my presentation, I'm going to really focus in on California climate policy. How is California advancing policy that addresses climate change in a way that also addresses and uplifts equity? So to get us going with the second half of the presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about different laws and policies that the state of California is advancing to address climate change. So many of you may know that California is recognized as a worldwide leader on addressing climate issues. And as a worldwide leader in these in addressing climate issues, this kind of soup letter, combination of numbers and letters, are laws that have been passed in California starting in 2006. Really, in 2006 is when we passed a transformative law that seek to reduce our greenhouse gases by the year 2020 to the levels that they were in 1990 as an economy. So how many of you think we are on track to meeting the goals established by AB 32, reducing greenhouse gases to the levels that they were in 1990 by this year, like right now? Go ahead and raise your hand if you think we're there. Okay, I can't see everybody, but I see a lot of nodding heads, which means I don't think we got there, right? Well, you'd be surprised to know that we did get there, and that we actually got there in 2018. So the state of California made significant progress towards getting to this goal, but now that we have done it, we now understand that that was actually the easy part. The harder part in 16, we have to have greenhouse gas emissions 40% below what they were in 1990. So if that doesn't make sense to you, think of it this way. By the year 2030, our population is going to increase dramatically. We're going to have a lot more housing, a lot more businesses, a lot more transportation, yet we're somehow supposed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions for all of technological advances that we have to make, and the level of decisions that collectively we have to endure are going to have to be fairly significant if we are going to reach that level of greenhouse gas reduction. So these next 10 years are going to be really important. And really, all of you who are today in college will be the ones responsible for probably implementing what we need to do to achieve these goals. So just keep this in mind. But this combined is what the state of California is doing to address climate change. All of those laws turned into programs and initiatives, many of the ones you see here. So we have all kinds of strategies in California to mitigate pollution. These are standards for vehicles, standards for buildings, standards for how we grow things, renewable energy goals, and other kinds of policies. One of the policies that's been implemented in California is called cap and trade. And you see a diagram here of what cap and trade looks like. Cap and trade is a market-based mechanism to reduce pollution by pricing it. So as you see in the diagram, there's a cap on the level of emissions that industry is allowed to make on a yearly basis. The emissions that they produce above that cap is priced and traded in a market, and that generates revenue. That revenue then is invested in California for projects that reduce greenhouse gases. And over time, the cap decreases, and it makes it more expensive to continue to pollute. And over time, it'll be so expensive to pollute that those industries will have to just make the decision to transition their whole operations to renewable energy. Now, this is a very controversial mechanism, And there's a couple of things that you should know that are inequitable. Number one is that it is still allowing industries to pollute. And as we talked about in the earlier part of our history, polluting facilities are where people of color live. So by its nature, it's polluting those communities most and providing, generating resources to reduce emissions throughout the state of California. So there's inequities built into the system. And secondly, California resources to generate revenue to make investments in reducing climate change. So the fact that we generate money off of this mechanism means that we're somewhat reliant on it, which means that we're kind of somewhat reliant on continuing to pollute. So in order for us to be able to really mitigate pollution, we have to figure out alternatives to this mechanism so that we can really ramp down emissions. But that said, it is generating a lot of revenue. So through November of 2019, that mechanism, cap and trade, has generated $12.7 billion for investments in the state of California that have gone towards the types of programs that you see on the screen: high-speed rail, affordable housing, renewable energy, clean cars, healthy soils, a bunch of different things that the state of California is investing in. This is a lot of revenue that other states are envious of and would love to have, but they don't have cap and trade systems. California is the only one that has a cap and trade system. But up until this point, we haven't talked about equity in climate policy, and that's what this slide is about. So ever since 2012, we've been working on climate equity policy and trying to establish laws that seek to advance climate equity. So what you see here are a set of laws that have equity at their core. Many of these, Greenlining helped to pass. These laws do a bunch of different things. One, it prioritizes investments into the most impacted communities. Two, it eliminates barriers to entry for businesses that want to contract with the state to be able to benefit in that revenue that is being generated. Three, it eliminates some barriers to participation of low-income communities for these kinds of programs by creating programs that are specifically designed for those people. And four, it creates programs that from the bottom up are all built with disadvantaged communities in mind. So I'm not going to go into the detail of all of these programs, but I am going to explore two that are really the most impactful for the work that we do at Greenlining. I'm going to talk about SB 535 and AB 1550. These policies combined direct a minimum of 35% of cap and trade revenue to priority communities in California. Priority communities in California are defined as disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. So the map that you see here identifies which communities qualify as disadvantaged and low-income and where this money is supposed to be targeted at. So a disadvantaged community is a community that is overburdened by poverty and pollution. And a low-income community is a census tract that is below 80% of state median income. And the combination is what qualifies as a priority community. So this map here is of Oakland, and if I was to compare it to a redlining map, it's going to cover many of the same communities. So I want to kind of reference back to that redlining history, is that is now where we're putting a lot of the investment from cap and trade into those communities. And this translates into real outcomes, right? Through November of 2019, over 57% of the funds that have been implemented have gone to the communities that qualify as priority. So this is just a breakdown of how that money is being spent. But again, something to note is that about 57% of the overall funds are going to those communities. And what they're going for are for investments in affordable housing, in urban forestry, in EV car share programs, and transit. So here you see some of the numbers and breakdowns of the types of programs that are being invested in those communities and the types of kind of numbers behind that. So what I wanted to show here with these set of policies and programs is that we're beginning to kind of emphasize and prioritize investments in those communities where poverty and pollution is most pronounced, and making an intentional effort in investing in those communities to improve quality of life and bring about economic opportunities that was denied to them due to the policies of the past. So we have to start somewhere in addressing those impacts. And for California, we're doing a lot of that through climate policy. So I want to stop here for a little bit and see if there's anything in the chat in terms of questions or things that I might be able to okay. So I'm just looking through the chat a little bit just to make sure that I can answer any questions that may have come up. There's a question about what year was the cap trade system initiated. The cap and trade system was started being implemented in the year 2016. It may have been generating revenue. I see here somebody mentioning 2013. There was an earlier version of cap and trade that was only for the energy sector that started being implemented earlier. And several years after, one that was economy-wide was implemented, and that's where most of this revenue that I talked about got started. Do we have any examples of urban forestry in the city of Santa Cruz? I encourage you all to check out CaliforniaClimateInvestments.org. On that website, there's a map that's able to identify where investments are occurring, and you can geo-search it by location, so you can see all of the investments that have been made in the city of Santa Cruz. So I don't know if there's an urban forestry one there, but I know that that map will be able to tell you. Okay, so if there's more questions, I'll try to answer them as we go along through the chat. Yes, I'll add the website in the chat in a second. Okay, so now let's talk about the last story. And as we're making decisions about what kind of story we want to create for ourselves tomorrow, we have to keep close the stories of the past and the present. The story of tomorrow is one where we just don't treat the symptoms of a broken system, but instead address the systematic injustices and disparities and respond to real problems like climate change and economic inequality. So this last part of the presentation is going to be on our framework at Greenlining called Making Equity Real, and how would you go about building equity into policy. What we use is this framework in which we operationalize equity. What we've noticed is that when policymakers are building policy, they break it down into what the policy is, what the process of the policy, what's the implementation, and what is the analysis. So for us, making equity real means breaking it down into the one to ensure that equity is showing up in them. So the framework is as follows, and this is something that you could use if you were to analyze a policy or if you were to be building a policy. So if you were to be analyzing a policy, these are the questions that you want to ask yourself. How is the policy in their goals defining equity, and can you identify it explicitly in their goals, or is it missing? When it comes to process, you want to think about how is this policy shifting the decision-making power towards those people that maybe have less access to power, to decision-making, and maybe are more impacted. When it comes to implementation, you want to ask, can I identify the concrete equity outcomes that this policy is trying to advance? And how is it explicitly directing opportunities to those that are most impacted? And then finally, on analysis and measurement, you want to ask, how is equity progress being measured? How do we know that the equity outcomes that we want to see are being achieved? These set of questions are actually really simple, but when you're looking at policies, you'll notice that it'll be difficult to identify many of these because most often than not, you don't see this level of detail in policies that are being built, even when they talk about wanting to advance an equity approach. So we call that equity washing. When a policy says, we want to do something on behalf of or to prevent a burden on communities that are most impacted, but there are no details in process, implementation, or analysis around how they're going to achieve that goal, we believe that that's not a legitimate equity approach, because they're basically stating a goal without telling us how they're going to get there. I want to give you this as an example. We work on a lot on electric vehicle strategies. And what you see on the column that says without equity is the type of language that you see associated with strategies that don't have an equity emphasis. And what you see on the column that says with equity is just the additional pieces that you have to think about how do we advance equity in our policymaking. So, for example, without equity, you may have a goal for California to have 1 million electric vehicles by the year 2023. This is a real goal, actually. We do have that goal in California. Without greenlining at the table, that goal was going to be as is stated there. When we came in, we said, you're just missing a couple of words. You have to add with low-income programs. And what that additional, three words allowed us to do is open up opportunities for programs that were specifically designed for low-income communities to gain access to these vehicles. Those were included below that first line. We wouldn't have had these additional programs had we had the more generic electric vehicle goal that you see there. So that's just it's a nuanced difference, but it's an important one in that we want to be explicit about who we ultimately seek to benefit from the policymaking that we're making. So just to go a little bit into further detail, when you look at goals, values, and mission, this is another example that's coming from the city of Portland. You see here on the final 2 bullet points, specific language around how they're describing their electric vehicle strategy being targeted at low-income populations and populations of color. Many times in government, you don't see that level of specificity because it doesn't have that equity approach. However, if we want equity outcomes, we need to have that level of specificity in the way that these policies are being put together. So we often look for those kinds of keywords. And if we see them missing, we want to promote that to be included in the approach. So when we're talking about process, this is guidance from the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency on mobility services and technologies. This is guidance for scooters, for car shares, for new mobility strategies. And what we wanted to highlight here for you was the way that the SFMTA is describing a process to include more equity in their approach. So you see here things like equitable access. You see here how they're describing transit as it relates to these populations. And this is the type of language that we want to see in a process-oriented section that emphasizes how we want to include those that have less power and less ability to influence decision-making into the process of an agency. And what this turns into is something like this. This is a picture from a car share program in the Central Valley called Van y Vienen. This program is directed at allowing low-income communities in the Central Valley to use electric vehicles as an indigenous car share program, and allows the participants that work on this program to really influence from the bottom up how this is going to be functioning. So these are the participants of the program. Many of them are the drivers of these vehicles. And the whole program itself is designed with their priorities and needs in mind. So this is the type of implementation that we want to see when we're thinking about equity, so that the benefits are directed primarily to these populations and not kind of just generally assume that it's going to benefit them without really knowing that that's really the case. And finally, on analysis, it's something that we often see missing from the approach altogether, but we do need to figure out how to measure equity outcomes associated with our goals and our strategies. So this is a framework that is developed by the UCLA Luskin Center on a program called Transformative Climate Communities. And what you see here is a way for them to analyze the impacts of this approach, broken down by objectives, goals, strategies, project types, etc. This is just an example of the way that you would develop analysis for equity, but largely we see analysis missing from policymaking, and it's something that we really emphasize to make sure that we're actually achieving the goals that we want to see through our policymaking. So that in a nutshell is what we call operationalizing equity or making equity real. It's 4 simple kind of steps that we emphasize in our work to make sure that we have the types of outcomes that begin to address those root causes that we talked about at the beginning of the session. So that wraps up my time in my presentation. I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts so before we take a break. As you do this work, if any of you that continue to do equity work, you'll notice that people will tell you that equity just complicates things and that it slows things down. But we definitely do not agree that it slows things down. We think that equity is not an obstacle. It's a foundation to the future that we want to have. And if we don't emphasize equity in our policymaking, we're just going to recreate the same injustices that we see today in the future. It might be a cleaner future, but it's not going to be a more just future. So as you continue to do your work on sustainability, on climate change, and if you're going to do equity work, just remind folks that equity can bind us together and make us more resilient. And a lack of equity is just going to recreate the same problems that we see today in our clean energy economy of the future. So with that, I'll pause and thank you for your time. I think we're going to take a break, and then I'll take some Q&A if anybody has questions.
Yeah, I've got a question. I was just looking over the website, and it's got a lot of really interesting things on it. And I was just kind of curious about how you got involved with it, and kind of what your process was to get where you are today.
Sure, thank you for asking. Happy to share. I got involved with Greenlining after doing some work at an organization called Green for All, a national organization working on pathways out of poverty using the green economy. But really, I landed on doing environmental policy, not by any kind of direct approach. Before, I basically started my professional career as a community organizer in San Francisco, working on affordable housing issues. From there, I went to planning school. I went to USC and received a master's in planning, and started really doing a lot of work on economic development and eventually transitioned into affordable housing development. I did that during the 2008 recession. So it was a very difficult time to be doing that kind of work. And out of necessity, I kind of had to look for another avenue. And somebody identified to me that I should apply at Green for All. But I felt like it wasn't a match because I hadn't done any sustainability work or had any kind of environmental policy background. Luckily, I applied, they gave me the job, and I realized then that one of the things about environmental policy is that it commands a great amount of economic resources based on the amount of investment that we need to make to transition our economy from a fossil fuel economy towards a clean energy economy. So whereas I thought all of it was related to environmental regulation, there's actually a fair amount of economic development that needs to happen in order to transition us towards that clean energy future that we need. And that's kind of where the intersection of my skill set and this issue area came together. How do we make sure that as we transition from one type of economy to a cleaner one, do we emphasize economic opportunities for those that have been kind of barred from that activity? And how do we prioritize investments into those communities that are in most need? That's something that I didn't learn in undergrad. I didn't learn in grad school, and I came to find out kind of on my own. But really, when you're talking about water systems, when you're talking about renewable energy systems, when you're talking about forests, when you're talking about sea level rise, the amount of money that is required to make those changes is incredibly significant. And most of those investments are going to be done by the public sector, which means that you can attach a lot of public policy to how that money is distributed. And that's where you can include a lot of this equity policy that we've been advancing at Greenlining. So I hope that answers your question.
If I may continue on that, since you were talking about how you kind of got involved just right off the bat into the 2008 crisis, and now that we're heading kind of into this one, what's if I may ask, what your policies are or plan of attack for kind of dealing with this situation, seeing how it's growing? And my major is actually economics, so I'm looking at this stuff with some serious. I wish I could have some optimism towards it, but it's kind of it doesn't look good. It definitely doesn't look good. So I'm just kind of curious about what your strategy is towards dealing with this current situation.
Yeah, really good question, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about this. In many ways, the issues that we were bringing to light through our climate change work are just a lot more pronounced now based on the COVID crisis. So we know the communities that are hit first and worst are those communities of color. And we know that in recovery, we often tend to gravitate towards things that are shovel ready or things that will quickly energize the economy. That kind of decision making tends to put those same groups at a disadvantage because they have a lot harder time being able to kind of participate in that. So our approach right now is, I would break it down into relief, recovery, and resilience. So for relief, we want to emphasize how do we move the kind of available resources that government has to be able to provide relief to those that need it the most. So for example, rental assistance to folks that may be vulnerable from being evicted because they don't have a job and they can't pay their rent, right? So whatever we can do as a government to be able to provide direct relief to those populations. Some things that have already happened that we were fairly surprised happened so quickly, but we're encouraged by them, are, for example, the $1,200 that were distributed to everyone and that paid their that was filed taxes last year. So that kind of universal basic income idea was something that was kind of surprising that happened so quickly, but we were encouraged by it. Of course, $1,200 is not enough. We need more resources, but at least it was a start. In California, the state of California worked with philanthropy to create a fund that's targeted at undocumented immigrants in the state, given the fact that they couldn't benefit from federal programs. So that's another kind of relief effort that is very much targeted at a population that's vulnerable. So relief is really important. Recovery is also important. Right now, we are working with state legislators on advancing potentially a $10 billion bond to be able to build climate resilience in the state of California, and in using that money, putting people back to work. So as we build our resilience to wildfires, to sea level rise, to drought, and to heat exposure, can we use the resources that the state has available to employ people in California to build that infrastructure? But the outcome is building our resilience to climate change. We think that that's a really good approach to kind of feed two birds with one seed and be able to put people back to work today, but build our long-term resilience to climate change. And then the last part is resilience. What are the types of things that we can do to fundamentally change the way that government functions and have an enduring equity impact into our long-term recovery? This is going to involve things like tax reform, things like kind of government reforms that are going to be more difficult to establish, but this is the right time to be thinking about those. Something that we learned is that starting from the 2008 recession to today, we saw the highest level of wealth inequality happen in the world. So after the 2008 recession, those that had money saw their wealth increase dramatically. And those who had very little money saw their wealth decrease. And it wasn't the same after the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, those with a lot of wealth saw their wealth decrease, and those with less wealth saw their wealth increase. The main difference between those two episodes were our laws. And our laws were the ones that determined how our recovery was going to address wealth inequality. So for this new recession, we're really thinking about how do we govern our recovery as to not increase our wealth inequalities, but rather decrease it. And you know, at the end of the day, it looks like wealth distribution. Jeff Bezos is on track to become a trillionaire. I didn't even know you could get that amount of wealth. At the same time that I believe we're close to 20% of our population has filed for unemployment, Jeff Bezos' wealth has increased by about $500 billion. There's something wrong with that equation and that system. And we need to address it at a systematic level, because it's just, we can't continue moving forward in that way. So sorry, that was a really long way, but it's a good question, and we've been thinking about it a lot.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I see a question about the EPA coming and removing lead from your soil in West Oakland, because this have been because of cap and trade funds. I don't believe so. That I know of, there is no program for soil remediation out of cap and trade resources. However, there's a lot of resources that California EPA uses to kind of clean up sites throughout the state. So I'm glad that that's something that happened. There's a lot of communities that are suffering from contaminated soils. And even worse, there's a lot of communities that never addressed the issue. So I'm glad that that happened in West Oakland. But I'm assuming that it came from another source of funding, not cap and trade. I also live in Oakland, so it makes me happy to know that that's something happening there. Yeah, I think it's probably coming from another source of funding.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, then I guess that's the end of class. So thank you so much, Alvaro. That was an amazing presentation. And thank you to everyone that showed up.
Yeah.
Really cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I just wanted to make a couple of plugs for you. One is we have a virtual summit coming up next week on Thursday. And if you'd like to participate, there are scholarships available in case you can't pay for the summit itself. So reach out to me. I'll include my email in the chat. And I'm happy to connect you to folks that can walk you through the scholarship process. It's going to be a full day. It's going to be a lot of great speakers, and you can join remotely. That's one plug. Second plug is every year Greenlining hosts fellows and summer associates in our organization. The fellows tend to be, is for a year-long fellowship. So these folks tend to be kind of graduates from master's programs or law schools. But the summer associates are intended for a 10-week summer associate program and are very much designed for folks that are in college right now. So our program is currently closed, but if you are interested, check out our website and you'll find details there around the summer associate program. And if you're interested, you should definitely apply. I think it's a great program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.